Jack had never believed in ghosts, monsters, or the supernatural. As a psychologist specializing in phobias, he'd built a reputation for unraveling the human mind's fears, layer by layer. Patients trusted him, and he enjoyed helping people shed their irrational terrors and reclaim their lives. But his newest patient, Claire, was unlike anyone he'd treated before. Claire was terrified of mirrors. She couldn't stand her own reflection, couldn't bear the glint of glass that reminded her of the world's many reflective surfaces. During their first session, she told Jack, voice trembling, that mirrors were gateways to something dark. She wouldn't elaborate, just repeated that when she looked into a mirror, something else looked back. Jack took notes with a skeptical smile. It was common for patients to have elaborate, irrational beliefs, but he prided himself on staying grounded in reality. Over the next few sessions, Claire's behavior became increasingly erratic. She began to come in pale, sleepless, claiming that she could feel her reflection watching her even when she wasn't near a mirror. She insisted that she saw shadows moving behind the glass. Jack grew intrigued. He wanted to confront her fear directly, to help her see that her phobia was nothing more than an illusion. So he suggested an experiment. He would bring her to the clinic's mirror room. The room had been built for phobia treatment. Its walls were lined with mirrors floor to ceiling. The effect was dizzying, a vast, endless series of reflections that twisted and distorted as you walked through it. He hoped the intense exposure would shake Claire out of her fear. The day of the experiment arrived, and Claire was visibly trembling. Jack placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder as they stepped inside. The lights overhead flickered as they clicked on, casting sharp, fractured glints off the mirrors. Claire's breathing was shallow, her eyes darting to each reflection, trying to avoid her own. "Take a deep breath," Jack instructed. "There's nothing here except reflections. Just you." He watched her face, her growing dread. Jack looked around the room, admiring the endless sea of reflections. He took a few steps, listening to the echo of their movements. Every mirror showed 100 versions of himself and Claire, shifting as they moved. He kept his focus on her as she pressed her hands to her temples, eyes wide, as if trying to suppress something only she could hear. "Listen, Claire, just a few more minutes. This is all in your mind," he assured her, though a slight chill crept down his spine. But then he noticed something strange. In one of the reflections, a small detail just out of place, he could swear he saw his reflection looking at him, even when he wasn't looking directly into the mirror. He frowned, turning back to face the real Claire. But Claire wasn't looking at him anymore. Her gaze had drifted to a mirror behind him, eyes locked on something in the glass. Her face drained of all color, her mouth trembling. "Jack," she whispered, "do you see it?" A cold wave of dread washed over him. Jack turned to look. At first, it was only his own reflection, staring back like it should have. But then, a flicker of movement. His reflection's mouth curled into a slow, unnatural smile. Jack knew he wasn't smiling. He took a step back, and his reflection followed, its eyes darker now, sharper, somehow wrong. He tried to shake it off, convinced it was just the lighting, just a trick of the room's angles. "See?" Claire said, her voice thick with tears. "I told you. They watch. And now you've seen them." Jack's pulse quickened as he moved closer to one of the mirrors, searching for a rational explanation. But the reflection didn't mimic his movements. It just stood there, grinning like it was savoring the moment. Jack's breathing grew ragged. He turned to Claire, but she wasn't in the same spot. The mirrors showed her figure somewhere behind him, her hands pressed against the glass, as if trapped on the other side. He spun around, but in the real room she wasn't there, only in the reflection. "Claire," he whispered, his voice hoarse. He stepped toward her image in the mirror, but as he did, his own reflection leaned in, its eyes dark and hollow, the grin stretched wider, impossibly wide. Panicking, he pressed his hands against the cold glass, calling her name again. The lights flickered, casting deep shadows across the mirrored walls. And then, silence. When the lights came back on fully, the room was empty. Jack's reflection was gone. He stared at the mirrors, the countless versions of himself, all vanished, except for one. In the corner, a single version of himself remained, just out of reach, watching him with a hollow, satisfied expression. And beside that reflection was Claire's, trapped in the glass, her face twisted in silent horror. Jack felt his heart hammering, but his limbs wouldn't move. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. The last thing he saw before the lights dimmed again was his reflection leaning close to the glass, whispering something he couldn't hear, but felt deep in his bones. He'd never believed in ghosts, but now, standing alone in the empty, echoing room, Jack realized he was about to become one. The door swung shut behind him, sealing him inside with his reflection forever.